Welcome to my talk newsfeed created by you. I'm going to just start for a second telling you a little bit about myself. I know most of you know me, not everybody. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and my work primarily focuses on issues of privacy. I'm in a fellowship program that looks at issues of electronic security and privacy. What that means for me is that I typically study information flows and how people attempt to control those flows across digital spaces. I'm also super interested in privacy norms and when and how they change. I particularly find the when they change and how they change super interesting as opposed to just established norms. So I tend to approach these questions from a symbolic interactionist perspective, and what that means is that I'm super interested in how people make meaning and how they make sense out of the interactions that they encounter in their everyday lives. So I was working on this project with a couple of colleagues. I was looking at Facebook users before they posted to their newsfeed. What were they thinking about? And I thought this was the most ideal picture. Thank you, Onion. What do you think about before you post? And this was in terms of privacy. So you worry about issues of context collapse or unintended audiences and leakage and all this stuff. And what I found was that it was interview data, and throughout the data I'm going through this, and I keep noticing this assumption that was coming out of a lot of users, which was that if I post something to my newsfeed, people who are my friends are probably going to see it. Unless they weren't there, they didn't log in on Friday. Or unless, there were these unlesses, but they never considered that there might be something else redirecting that information, and it was driving me bonkers, and I kept thinking about it and thinking about it. So we did this project, it was great, it was a fun project. But for my own research, it kind of drove me to start thinking about things in a little bit different way. So that kind of led to these questions. In regards to Facebook, I came here to ask the question, how do users make sense of newsfeed? Underlying that is a bigger question about how users make sense of algorithmic systems. So that kind of gives you the setup for where I came before, or where I was before, and how I came to be here asking this particular question. One thing that I think is really important that gets lost when we start talking about algorithms, which is something that many of the people here have written about, is that there's a really long history of things that have happened on the interwebs. And we start first there, looking at internet studies, and as Nancy mentioned, this is a rough talk, so I just started typing names and like citations I don't think of. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list for all intents and purposes. But what do we get when we look at internet studies? It's interesting because relatively recently there's been this notion that it reminds me of the hypodermic needle theory that we're combating this thing that actually never happened, or this position that people never took, which was that there were things that happened online and things that happened offline. And if you look at the beginning of internet studies, the first questions they approached these with were, how does what happened in digital spaces influence what's happening offline? And vice versa. We've always seen these as recursive things. So this notion that what happens online affects offline relationships, and that people do relational work on SNS, we know it's really heavily talked about in Nancy's work and in Zizi's work, and people that Steve Jones, the people that I work with closely. So that's something that's that directs the way that I approach this problem of trying to understand users and algorithms. We understand affordances and how they might direct users' behaviors, but we have to be mindful, and this is really something that comes out of internet studies, that we have to be mindful of how this space, which was always a user-generated space, and that's directly quoting a great article by Nancy, it was always user-generated. What changed was that it became a space where commercialized and professional material started showing up in the interwebs as we know them. And so then we started distinguishing between user-generated. So how can we be mindful of the space and how's that changed as a result of that commercialization? In algorithm studies, and we have a couple of great scholars of algorithm studies in here, there's problems with studying algorithms for a number of reasons. One, as Tarleton has pointed out, people use algorithm as a stand-in, particularly social scientists. We like to use the term algorithm as a stand-in for many things, and we tend to, I had an image of a wizard up there, but somehow it got lost in one of the edits. It's been a joke kind of around the office because Nick set around a thing where you can replace the word algorithm with wizard in your browser. So every time you see the word algorithm, you see the word wizard. But what's true about that is that there is a tendency to try to ascribe it too much power. And so we need to spend some time unpacking what we mean as social scientists when we say the word algorithm, as well as what users mean, as well as what computer scientists mean. And Nick's doing some really neat work looking at the ethnography of people who create algorithms is one way that we can understand them. Because there are multiple challenges, but if you want to just go and study an algorithm, how do you study an algorithm, first of all? Most of these systems have multiple algorithms running. They're always changing. There's a number of issues that they're black boxed, so on the one hand, we can't get into them. As Nick points out, even if we could, what would that tell us? There's a certain level of expertise, and there are multiple people working on any particular algorithm at any time. So it's not this neatly packaged thing that we can just untie and have an understanding of. And platform studies, as I'm kind of describing, is a little broad. They're very, of course, platform studies, but Couldry, Gillespie, Pfaffenberger, would you call him platform studies? I don't know, he's more STS, I guess, but he's kind of influenced my thoughts in this area, because what we need to do is take these, we have these technologies that we take for granted in our everyday life. And you can look at, of course, when old technologies were new is also a communication style study, look at that. We need to take moments to look at how we got to where we are, what old definitions were, how they changed. And particularly, Couldry and Van Dyke focus on this rebuilding of sociality. So because these are socio-technological systems, and the social is starting to become redefined by what's happening on the technical. So we use verbs like friend and like and things like that. And what does that mean? We need to think of what it used to mean and where we are now. What are the effects of quantifying friendship and trying to measure those things? And what about the influences of commercialization in these spaces, and who are platforms serving? And especially in light of those competing interests between users and platforms. So the commonality here is that we need to understand systems, we need to understand sociality. We need to understand how users understand systems, understand sociality, how they assert their agency in the face of these things, and we need to present, and how they present challenges to these for-profit systems. So enter my study, Facebook. I particularly took this ancient original picture of Facebook for a reason, to kind of remind everybody that Facebook has changed quite a bit over the years. Here's a brief history of newsfeed, and I'm not even sure if this is complete. It's really actually difficult to find all of this stuff, and maybe that's something we might want to start doing, is every time we know to change, to put it somewhere, because it's hard to go back. You have to go back through, to get this, I had to go back through popular media studies, newspapers and tech blogs and things like that. So I can't attest to the entire accuracy of this, but what I can tell you is that there have been a number of changes made to newsfeed throughout its history. Does anybody remember when it rolled out in 2006? Yeah. Some people yes, and some people no, actually. And I think that speaks to the normalizing factor that this type of work is getting at. When newsfeed rolled out, the day after it rolled out, there was an open letter from Mark Zuckerberg. And it said, "We really messed this one up. When we launched newsfeed and minifeed, we were trying to provide you with a stream of information about your social world. Instead, we did a bad job of explaining what the new features were, and an even worse job of giving you control of them. I'd like to try to correct those errors now." So minifeed was relatively done away with. Newsfeed remained, but you were given a lot more privacy controls over how you could, over what information would show up in those feeds. And it's fun to read this letter because it kind of suggests that Facebook might be listening to its users and wanting to know, how they can make them happy. Flash forward, and what do we see on our newsfeed every day? This is basically minifeed. So it took them a few years, but they were what was horribly wrong, and we hear you, and we're really sorry. Facebook will take, I wish I could remember where I read this, but it was like 3 steps forward, and then users push them 1 step back. And when they want something, they tend to continue pushing forward until they ultimately get what they want. And tickers are a really interesting thing because it relies on broadcasting the actions that you do on Facebook as though it's content. So if you like something, or if you follow, you friend someone, or you like a page, that's the type of stuff that tends to show up in the ticker. So if we look at Facebook's definition of what is newsfeed right now, it's a pretty relatively straightforward definition, I think. Newsfeed is a constantly updated list of stories in the middle of your homepage. Everybody here is aware of what newsfeed is. But what we find out is that nothing is ever straightforward about Facebook. Many Facebook users found out that there's reason to believe that many Facebook users found out that their feeds were filtered through what was known as the social contagion study, or the emotional contagion study that happened last summer. There's been other work that's shown that, and little work has been done on users and what they know about what's happening in their news feed as a system. And the work that has been done suggests that they don't know that there's a filtering process that happens. So that is where my study kind of comes in. I'm looking at news feed created by you. Now, I can't claim that this was causal, but shortly after the emotional contagion study, these videos started to appear in Facebook users' news feeds as sponsored content. The videos, what they call films, were created by B-Reel Productions, and they said on they did an actual, it's a presentation in and of itself, but they did a case study as one of their products, B-Reel did. And so from that page, they explained that they were to help quell confusion about what newsfeed is. Even though everyone has one, some people, interestingly, don't know how they work, which is crazy to them, right? So they made these films, if you will, to explain, to help users understand what newsfeed is and how it works. There were 9 films that were pushed out, and those received 103 million views. We know that views is a suspect term in the world of Facebook that recently came out, but for what it's worth, they received 102 million views. And according to B-Reel, the highlighted features in the videos saw a 30% increase in views, and that there was a positive sentiment increase for the Facebook brand. Facebook Tips is an official Facebook page, you can tell by the seal, and they actually play home to 5 of those videos. I actually came to know about these videos because it showed up in my feed, and I clicked on it and was like,